Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. We are joined by Leonardo Bonanni. Leonardo, thank you so much for joining us on Future of XYZ today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's really exciting. We're going to be talking about the future of sustainable supply chains. And you have deep expertise in this. You in 2011 founded SourceMap, which is really, I think, and I'll let you speak to it, but a SaaS enterprise, data company that's really implementing software that helps people kind of see end to end their supply chain. I mean, and all the various issues that potentially could be in there. I think that as we think about the future of sustainable supply chains, there are more elements than the average person could possibly conceive of. And I want to get into that because when we go to the shelf or when we look at what we're purchasing or what we're wearing or what we're eating or anything else, I think we really need to be thinking about what it is exactly that we're buying. And I think your software and your company is really helping educate both companies as well as consumers.
I couldn't have said it better. Yeah, no, I started SourceMap basically to, elevate supply chains to another level of sustainability. And there's two sides of what we do. I mean, one is help consumers absolutely be informed about the products, the brands that they buy from, and uh, know what kinds of environmental, social standards those brands are upholding. And the other side, which is really the bread and butter of what we do, is actually helping these brands, these manufacturers, implement responsible practices across their supply chains, all the way down to the raw materials. And I think that that's the biggest thing that characterizes SourceMap and our approach is this end to end that you mentioned, which is to say, it's not enough to just look at is the packaging recycled, is the product organic. You really have to know that at every stage of the supply chain, from the farm, from the mine, through the factories, through the warehouses, through the shipping, that every step of the life of the product, it's been handled in a responsible way that reflects your values.
Well, what's so great about this? I mean, I think back, I've been fascinated by this work for a long time. I feel like I'm always saying that, like it's like 20 plus years of being fascinated by, kind of what I'll call conscious capitalism before it had that moniker. But what's really interesting about supply chain is even a few years ago, much less a couple of decades ago, that I would guess that the average company did not have any transparency, right, or visibility into anything beyond perhaps their direct vendors. So when we talk about manufacturing and any product, you just mentioned packaging, right? You have packaging, you have raw materials, you have ingredients, you have all sorts of different components that go in. And sometimes you have a direct relationship, and sometimes you have many vendors who are providing to those vendors, so tier two, tier three. And when I was at Adidas, back in kind of 10, 15 years ago now, this is one of the things I was responsible for was the factory allocations and understanding like what levels of influence could we exert at what places on both, sustainability, so water consumption and dyes and responsible material usage and everything, but also labor. So talk to me a little bit, like when you started SourceMap in 2011, why did you start it? What were the issues or concerns that you were really trying to solve for?
Well, this was, so you have to think about it as a project that came out of my research, which was in media studies. And this was a media project. And I had, been involved in sustainability. I was a product designer. I was trying to make a green product that would make the world better. And every time I tried to look into, a little bit more information, should I use this material? Should I use this manufacturing technique? Should I source in this country or that country? I came up against basically no data, no quantitative metrics that I could use to say I should definitely, you should use glass bottles, not stainless steel, or you should use, single use plastic here, but you should use, reusable ceramic there. And the lack of data really stemmed from what I identified as a media problem. And basically, supply chains had been so opaque for such a long time that at the end of the day, you didn't know whether you were buying something that was made in a green steel mill or in a dirty steel mill. You didn't know really the source of the raw materials, where all the risks were. And so I decided to tackle it from a media perspective. And I think it's probably the only supply chain software company that started out as an activist project. Basically, I said, we have the internet. It's just, this was around 2007, 2008. We just started getting access to Google Maps. We started to use social networks on a very big scale. And all the excuses that had been in industry, that you can't know where things come from because there are thousands of suppliers halfway around the world. Many of them don't have access to sophisticated technology. And I said, hold on, but if I can watch a video on YouTube that somebody shot, of what they're having for lunch in Kuala Lumpur, then I'm sure that a multinational could figure out what's going on in a farm, in a factory halfway around the world. And so basically I just put together this demo of using social networks, using crowdsourcing, using Google Maps to show that one day soon all of this supply chain data would be visible. It would be something that would be accessible even to the general public. And I shopped this demo around, on the one hand to journalists and activists and NGOs, and on the other hand to manufacturers. And funny enough, the people who gravitated the most to this demo were the manufacturers, who said, "Wait a second, we've been using legacy software that was built in the '70s, SAP, IBM, Oracle. We have no way, the databases are powerful enough to go, to find the suppliers of the suppliers of the suppliers, to zoom in on the map, for 500,000 cocoa farms or, Indonesian palm oil plantations. We would love that power because ultimately, we're worried that we're not going to be able to deliver enough stuff if we don't know where it's coming from. But none of the technology that was out there before could handle it. And so I basically flipped from an activist into an enterprise software provider and said, we're going to use this technology. And they called my bluff, and I said, okay, you want to fix the problem? And yeah, we've been building the tech for about 15 years now. And the long story short is, there's a lot of companies, either because they have an impact mission or because they fear not knowing what they don't know about their supply chain, and they've adopted supply chain mapping, which is what we call this process, all the way down to the raw materials. And many of them did it years ago, and then now it's become much more widespread because of all these new laws that require due diligence in the supply chain.
Well, I want to come to the regulatory pressures right now, but I want to come back to that. I want to talk about those clients who you have. Like, there are, in fact, certain industries for whom supply chain mapping is more relevant or less relevant, and the reasons why. But you guys at SourceMap right now, you have Hershey's as a client, you have Mars, which many people don't know the name of, but it's like M&Ms among a million other consumer products and food products. You have Williams Sonoma, you have the shoe company Vans, you have Timberland, you have a bunch of others. Like, it seems to me like there's some clear industries there. But what do these people come to you for? Like, what are the specific things, and why does it really matter to their business besides the regulation? And is there like a commitment of timeline? Like, as we look to the future of this, like, this isn't something that happens overnight, and it's not something that's a one-off. So what are they saying? What are they coming to you for? What are they doing with it?
We had the very good luck right out the gate. So the company got founded in 2011. Within a few months, we had some really blue chip clients already willing to try the technology out and see what they could discover about their supply chains. And we call it supply chain discovery, which is the process where they, ask their suppliers who their suppliers are, and then ask those suppliers who their suppliers are. Essentially, like a LinkedIn for supply chains. And we had early. It was rough going because in 2011, no company was going to use the cloud and crowdsource data for its supply chain management. So we were a bit ahead of our time. But we were very lucky in a way that there was a few things that had just happened. So there was a tsunami that had just hit in Japan, and it had wreaked havoc on global supply chains. But it took weeks for automakers and computer makers to figure out exactly what had happened and why it was important to them. And so they funded some of the early research, and they were willing to do it as kind of an innovation project outside of their four walls. And then we had a lot of interest from the food sector. So you mentioned some of those customers really, very early on aware that there were social problems in supply chains. There was a civil war in West Africa in 2013. It ravaged cocoa production, and it had a direct impact on prices. I think they doubled or tripled. There was all sorts of issues around child labor, forced labor.
Mm.
You saw deforestation happening in Indonesia around palm oil, rubber, and other commodities. And so we saw the food industry, because it was sustainability, it fell outside of the traditional supply chain. They were allowed to use the cloud. And they asked us basically build a social network that would connect us with the farmers, who we buy from ultimately, and let's figure out what's going on in these communities, what's going on in these forests, where can we have the biggest impact. And people always ask me, so why were they doing this? It was not the law. There were
Yeah.
some risks, some lawsuits, but ultimately, I think there's a few things that underpin this. There's a trend where brands that have very valuable products, very valuable brands, they want to protect those brands at all
Yes.
costs. They don't want it to come out in the press that something, a popular candy bar is tied to, some horrible social environmental problem.
Yep.
They also wanted to attract really great people to work for them. And that's actually one of the unsung heroes of responsible sourcing, which is, people want to work for companies that have good supply chains. Nobody wants to go to work in the morning and find out that they're, doing something horrible halfway around the world.
Yeah.
Um, and and it was competitive. I mean, I think that, these companies that were willing to try new technology before any of their competitors get that visibility. By the time they had installed SourceMap, they had intimate understanding of how cocoa farmers were living, how much they were making, what practices there were, what the yields were, how much fertilizer they were using. So there's a lot of knock-on effects where they have responsibility and accountability for social environmental practices in the fields, but they also have a lot more insight into, how's the crop doing this year, and
Exactly.
how are we going to be able to source enough stuff.
Well, and that's, I mean, that's, as you say, that's an added bonus to getting closer to your suppliers, really, and understanding. I think for anyone who's watching or listening this who doesn't fully understand supply chain or just has some vague understanding, I think the complexity of supply chain is, I mean, even with source map, right, is so incredible, because you're talking about like how, for instance, civil war in West Africa can impact the cocoa supply. Well, you're talking just about like the cocoa beans for chocolate, right? And you're just talking about starting there with the raw material. I mean, there's so many things that cocoa goes into at the end product, whether you think about on shelf, whether it's like, a Hershey's, cooking, baking chocolate, or whether it's a candy bar, or whether it's a high-end chocolate, at a patisserie in Paris. I mean, there are all the things that go along that, value chain is what we say, to get to the consumer purchase, or even to the end of life cycle in certain products, especially in fashion. It is supply chain. And there is this, we're calling this the future of sustainable supply chains, but there's this hype around the word sustainability now, and around responsible supply chain. What are the elements? I mean, you talked about labor, and I want to be able to dive into that. There's deforestation we've talked about. So let's talk about what are the elements that you're able, through source map, that you think that we're tracking and tracing, that will make this sustainable supply chain of the future.
Great question. So so there's a few things. So laying the groundwork now. What you said is totally accurate. Like, so even a simple product, you think something you buy for $1, $2, a candy bar, or a T-shirt. It actually most likely has thousands of suppliers all around the world, just contributing to that. And that's not even getting into computers, automobiles, airplanes, where you could have millions of suppliers. And so the very first thing is to say, okay, where is the risk in my supply chain? And traditionally, you would go to NGOs, you would get audits conducted, you would go to certifiers, but they could effectively only visit so many people, audit so many things, measure, once a year, and a lot fell through the cracks. Let alone the fact that we're working with a big food company. They're going to have 250,000 hazelnut farmers, or 500,000 cocoa farmers, all contributing into the tens of thousands of tons that they buy. So wrapping your head around that, effectively companies go in and they say, okay, where's my risk? And inevitably, the risk is at what we call the first mile, which is either that farm or that mine.
Mm.
It's the place that's most likely that there's no electricity, there's no internet, there's no audit. There may not be schools or water pumps or health clinics.
And
And
where
so
people are getting paid the least in the supply chain as well, right?
Almost always, right?
Yeah.
And so we said, okay, you got to go to the raw material and then work your way back. And inevitably, the raw material, the risks are higher, but also the accountability is less because there's maybe less infrastructure, maybe less government oversight, maybe less technology, and that's essentially what we've landed on as the most effective tool. And most of our customers, if you look at, we're heavy into apparel, footwear, food, flavorings, but also now cosmetics, also now pharmaceuticals. Anytime a company goes down this road, they will say the problems are there. What are the problems? Yes, you have land use issues like deforestation, endangering habitats, biodiversity, water use, and then you have all of the social issues, which have really taken, um, a much more important position ever since the U.S. enforcement of the ban on products of forced labor. So you have extreme poverty, you have child labor, forced labor, trafficked labor, and all sorts of associated issues. That basically, you have a context in which there's no schools. It's very unlikely that kids are going to school. If there's no health clinics, no water pumps, it's very unlikely that women can give birth safely. So issues like that. So there's a whole world of issues in those very let's say, underserved, but also under accounted for first mile parts of the supply chain, and that's where we focus because that's where the biggest benefits can be had. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to
Hmm.
really raise those standards,
Yeah.
and then we usually work downstream. It's true that there are issues in factories. There's issues in shipping. There's issues in automated environments and warehousing, but those are usually secondary to those first mile issues.
Um, Thank you for shedding light on that. We do want to come to, and we don't have a huge amount of time, but just talk about the regulation. We always try to do these in 20 minutes on these huge topics that, but that's the model. So, as I think about regulation, I mean, there is California passed a Supply Chain Transparency Act, which was quite profound, although it only is for companies that have presence in California and 100 million or more in annual revenue. So it's a little bit limited. And it, as you said, it's really focused on forced labor issues. There is hopefully pending, in the fashion and apparel industry, some regulation. The EU has bits and pieces all over and something pending. But Congress actually just passed something at a federal level in June of this year, which is really, I mean, exciting, but also kind of probing that Chinese beast of like forced labor coming out of like the Uyghurs in northern China. I mean, that is obviously a very, very big concern, and a very important geopolitical issue. It's not only a sourcing supply chain concern. I mean, some of these things that you're touching on, as you said, have governance lack, and then we are trying to get other countries to step in and enforce company regulation for things that other countries aren't taking care of. I mean, there is a real impact of responsibility and accountability that your business and other businesses like yours are undertaking. I mean, is that really kind of the mission here, is to clean the world up for the better? Or is there, what is kind of that future vision that you have of sustainable supply chains?
Absolutely. I mean, look, at SourceMap, our mission is to raise standards of living across supply chains from the first mile to the last. So you nailed it. I mean, it's uh, look. I think consumers are fed up with the idea that you're buying something, in a country that has certain regulations and standards and enforcement, but it could be made in another country that has none of those, and so you're buying something that could be contributing to the exact opposite social or environmental conditions than those you vote for and support and pay for. So yeah, people are fed up. And the interesting thing was, last year I was able to testify to the Senate Finance Committee, and I was actually asked to testify by industry. I was actually a witness on the Republican side, because government is also fed up with it, and so are responsible companies, because nobody wants to compete with someone who is able to use forced labor,
Right.
or not even know what kind of labor they're using, because then you're at a huge disadvantage on the marketplace. And so these new laws, I mean, effectively, what's radically, people always said Europe had tougher standards than the U.S. when it came to environmental regulations, and that may have been the case. But with the U.S. ban on products of forced labor actually being enforced, the U.S. became far and away the leader in terms of supply chain due diligence, as it's called, this
Mm,
accountability. And they said, look, it's not enough that you ask your suppliers to sign a code of conduct that says we won't use forced labor. It's not enough that you sponsor NGOs or you get some audits. You need to prove to us, to the US government, that every shipment that comes into the country has a chain of custody that's believable and that goes back to every stop along the way from the farm to the US has been monitored, and it is not contributing to these horrible practices such as forced labor. And obviously this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that just started being enforced in June is the culmination of that. But what's really amazing there is they said, look, it's not enough to want to do good. You need to prove to us that nobody along the chain was a bad actor who tried to inject products that were made unethically into the supply chain. And by creating the requirement to map and trace all of these products, you're actually rooting out way more of the bad actors from the supply chain. And Europe has now basically followed suit and is asking for traceability in order to get products into the EU starting next year.
that was a very, very helpful oversight. So I obviously I know you're an expert. I mean, it's fascinating to me that you did your undergrad at Columbia and architecture and sculpture and got a master's at MIT in architecture. The way things are built, and then went on to the media lab and followed up with your master's and PhD. But it is fascinating because it is about the way that things are built and interconnected and interdependent. So I see a little bit of a red thread there, Leo. I want to close with one question that you guys have this provocation out there in the world as SourceMap, saying that one day soon you'll be able to scan a product on a store shelf and be connected to the people who made it through the SourceMap social network. Talk to me for a minute about how that works and what the value you see for both the consumer and the laborer.
It was the original vision, right, before even the iPhone came out and before QR codes, which we've all grown to hate at this point, where there was essentially, with a product, no matter the kind of product, there was an infinite capacity to have data about that product, and to then use that data for positive things, which is for us, which meant transparency that would lead to verifiable positive social and environmental practices every step of the supply chain. And it was a provocation that we said, consumers will one day expect this, and either as a brand you're going to provide it proactively, use it as part of your mission and your brand to gain trust and to gain consumers, or you're going to be caught on your back heels responding to requirements, unable to fully eliminate the risks because you didn't take care to talk to your whole supply chain, monitor it, and improve it ahead of time. And that's exactly where I think this is all going to go. So it's not that governments will create a standard and everyone is going to check the box and be a little bit better or a little bit worse than the standard. It's not that we're going to rely on an eco label that says this is a good product or this is a bad product. It's that brands are going to be competing with each other for better supply chains. And you've seen it already, right? Corporate social responsibility is really being replaced by impact. And companies want impact. They pick issues that matter to their consumers and they go proactively to do better than their competition. I think that's the path forward. And to use that in the marketing and in the product placement and in the connections you build with consumers, you're going to see some products launching in the fall with a source map traceability in new sectors that have never had that before, like the luxury industry and the cosmetics industries. And I think you're going to see one by one all of these brands really come up with their own ways to provide that transparency, provide that traceability, which essentially means to consumers like, yes, you can trust us, and if you don't trust us, you can even verify because we give you the data on where the stuff came from and what are the programs that we put in place. And I think we're going to become conscious consumers. We may not have to do the scan because if you look for a company and they've already published their supply chain on SourceMap, you can be sure that they're doing
They're
better than
walking the walk.
and yeah, and that they're willing to have you and anyone else, wander around those factories and check it out for themselves.
Yeah.
So it's really above and beyond.
It's fantastic. I have to say we've all come a very, very long way in a very reasonably short time. And it's high time. So thank you for the work you're doing at SourceMap. It's super interesting. I love it. And thanks for joining us on Future of XYZ today.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone listening, if you like this conversation about the future of sustainable supply chains with Leo, make sure that you check out their website at sourcemap.com. Also, be sure to follow and subscribe to Future of XYZ anywhere you get your favorite podcasts, on YouTube as well as on Instagram. And we will look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks again, Leo. Have a great one.
Thank you.